You lean against the shrine's cool stone and exhale slowly. The air is thick with dreams now, soft and golden, like honey stirred into warm milk. The tulip has carried us far, from palace halls to market stalls, from perfume vials to postal seals, but now, it's time to drift higher. Tonight, you're not just wandering Istanbul's streets anymore. You're going to a place most Ottoman citizens never saw, but many dreamed about, the imperial tulip gardens of the Sultan himself. You blink, and suddenly you're inside the imperial garden of Topkapi Palace. It's not just one garden, of course, it's an unfolding world of hedges and fountains, paths winding like lazy thoughts. The tulips here don't just bloom. They perform. They're arranged in crescent moons, stars, winding verses of poetry shaped out of flowers. Each bed is a sentence. Each color, a whisper, a fountain trickles beside you, shaped like a shell. Water drips from the mouths of carved stone turtles, an Ottoman symbol of longevity. But tonight, it's not the turtles that matter. It's the tulips. Hundreds, maybe thousands, blooming in the moonlight like little silk flames. The garden was designed not for strolling, but for viewing. From balconies, terraces, marble pavilions. You imagine standing beside the Sultan himself, hands tucked into your sleeves, gazing down at this floral theater, and yes, this garden was choreographed. Ottoman gardeners, called bastanchis, were more than just shovel-wielders. They were botanists, designers, whisperers of the earth. They worked in secretive crews, often overseen by eunuchs from the palace inner court. Each spring, they would unveil their creation, a new layout, a new palette, a fresh pattern made from living color. One year might favor blood-red blooms, the next, delicate whites and purples like bruised porcelain. Some arrangements even recreated famous battle scenes or calligraphy verses using nothing but tulips. Yes, really. And if you're thinking, that sounds like the world's most anxiety-inducing puzzle, you'd be right, but here's where it gets even more surreal. The Sultan sometimes held nighttime garden parties during peak bloom, lavish, luminous spectacles. Guests arrived in embroidered robes, stepping from gondola-like boats along the Bosphorus. Servants lit thousands of floating paper lanterns, which drifted over the tulips like glowing jellyfish. Musicians played soft reed flutes and hammered dulcimers, their melodies twining with the scent of blooming bulbs and saffron pastries. And the tulips, they gleamed under firelight, casting shadows that danced like delicate ghosts. Even the frogs went quiet. Historians still argue whether these parties were intimate affairs or diplomatic showcases, whether they were about tulips or simply used tulips as backdrops for power. But everyone agrees, they were unforgettable. You pass beneath an archway twined with flowering vines and find yourself in a secluded corner of the imperial garden. A raised platform overlooks a reflecting pool, perfectly still except for a stray leaf drifting across its glassy surface. The pool mirrors the stars, the tulips, and you. For a moment, you don't know which way is up. Beside the pool is a tiny kiosk, a pleasure pavilion used for quiet poetry readings and, allegedly, for naps. You smile. Clearly, the Sultan had excellent taste. Inside the kiosk is a tiled wall, and on that wall, something strange, a painted map, not of the empire, but of its gardens. Yes, the Ottomans loved their tulips so much, they mapped them. Each imperial garden had its own bulb registry, catalogued down to the last petal curl. One scholar referred to it as horticultural bureaucracy, which feels both hilarious and deeply Ottoman. And oh, the bulb names. They weren't just red tulip number 3. No. They were poetry in miniature, those who burn the heart, the slightly embarrassed one, She blushes in moonlight, the whispering flame. You read these aloud in your mind, and suddenly the garden feels alive with personalities. Every flower, a drama queen. Every bed, a love letter. You sit down on a bench carved from white marble, cool and solid beneath you. A soft wind stirs the tulips, and they rustle like satin skirts. Somewhere, a peacock calls, not because it has anything profound to say, but because peacocks are basically nature's divas, and you realize, this was never just about a flower, it was about control. About taking something wild and taming it into elegance. About arranging chaos into beauty. About saying, yes, the world is unpredictable, but in this square meter of soil, everything makes sense. For a sultan ruling a vast, fractious empire, maybe that mattered more than it seems, and perhaps, on some quiet spring evening, he came here not to show off, but to sit. To breathe. To forget the campaigns and treaties and betrayals for a little while. To look at a tulip, not for what it meant, but simply for what it was. Maybe you understand that, too. The marble bench cools your back as you lean into it, eyes half-lidded as the stars blink gently overhead. Somewhere behind you, a breeze nudges a pavilion curtain, and a faint perfume of crushed mint and warmed stone floats by. You're still inside the Sultan's tulip garden, but now, we're pulling back from the petals and taking a broader view. Because tonight, it's time you learn how this delicate obsession wasn't just a cultural quirk, it quietly shaped the Ottoman economy, yes, flowers. And finance. Strange bedfellows, but trust me, it gets oddly fascinating. You start walking again, following a cobbled path that curves around an orchard, then opens up into a courtyard lined with lanterns. There's a low hum, almost like bees, but softer. You realize it's people, talking in hushed tones. You're at a tulip market, and this isn't just some quaint flower stall. No, this is economic performance art. Here, during the height of the 18th century tulip period, roughly 1718 to 1730, tulip bulbs were being traded like treasure. You pause beside a merchant with a long beard and a wooden case full of bulbs, each nestled in its own velvet-lined groove. Some are round, others slightly teardrop-shaped. Each bears a tiny tag with an Ottoman name, like the sun's patience or petals of the jinn. He strokes one like it's a kitten and whispers its price. It's absurd, in today's currency. Some rare bulbs were worth more than a skilled artisan's annual wage. Others went for the price of a small shop or a city house. And it wasn't just about beauty, it was status, rarity, exclusivity. The right tulip could open doors. The wrong one could make you look tragically unfashionable. You nod, amused, and keep walking through the crowded square. Around you, traders negotiate in half-whispers, sliding folded ledgers across cafe tables, scribbling numbers, sketching tulip silhouettes. It's less Wall Street, more Bloom Street. One man gestures theatrically at a pale yellow bulb. Only 3 in existence. He insists, voice rising. His customer arches an eyebrow. Then why are you selling it? A nearby onlooker chuckles into her coffee. Even the Sultan's court got involved. Records show that tulip prices were sometimes tracked like royal inventory. And yes, gardeners were reprimanded for mismanaging bulbs. Imagine being demoted because you overwatered the softly sighing one, and this economic fever wasn't entirely silly. Many historians argue that the tulip trade became a proto-capitalist bubble, the empire's own gentle version of the Dutch tulip mania. Historians still debate whether it was a true speculative frenzy or just a fashionable phase with inflated price tags. But here's the thing, people took it seriously. That led to curious consequences. You pass a modest house with a peculiar sign nailed to the door, "No bulbs accepted in payment." Apparently, there were times when people tried to pay debts in tulips. Whether this worked is unclear. Imagine telling your landlord, "Can't give you coin, but how about 2 blushing sunsets and a shy whisper?" Spoiler: landlords don't usually like poetry, but this flower-fueled microeconomy also meant new jobs popped up: professional bulb scouts, garden consultants, even tulip appraisers. You imagine one now, a stooped man with a monocle, examining petals with more reverence than a jeweler handling sapphires. And while all this bloomed in Istanbul, ripples spread across the empire. Merchants in Damascus, Cairo, even the Balkans began requesting rare tulip bulbs from the capital. Bulbs traveled via caravan routes and shipping barges, swaddled like royal infants in wool and straw. Some didn't survive. Others thrived in foreign soils, birthing strange hybrids that sparked international envy. You stop at a stall where a man is carefully painting tulips onto parchment, botanical portraits, sold as luxury goods to those who couldn't afford the real bulbs. They're gorgeous, yes, but faintly tragic. Flowers frozen in ink. Suddenly, a thought drifts through your mind like smoke: how fragile it all was. Beauty, obsession, and inflation don't usually mix well. And by the late 1720s, the tulip economy began to wilt, prices plateaued. Rare bulbs lost their mystery. Fashion moved on, slowly at first, like a distracted guest slipping out of a party, then more quickly, like a tide pulling away. You find yourself at a tea stand, where a vendor with tired eyes offers you a clay cup. You sip, and it's warm and faintly herbal, perhaps brewed with tulip petals, though it mostly tastes like nostalgia. He nods as if to say, "Yes, we all chased it. We all dreamed." Because in the end, the tulip was never just a flower. It was a currency of hope, for elegance, for identity, for a better tomorrow wrapped in crimson and cream. You sit beside a flickering lantern, watching shadows of tulips dance along the walls. People drift through the market like moths, still haggling, still dreaming, still believing. Even after the craze faded, the echoes remained, and you, lucky traveler, have seen how a single flower wove itself into trade, vanity, and the very breath of an empire. You leave the market behind as the call to prayer rises faintly in the distance, echoing through sleepy alleys, bouncing off domes, and curling into the tulip-scented air like a lullaby. You're not in a hurry anymore. With the rush of buying and selling behind you, we can take a quieter path now. One that winds toward the quieter side of the tulip obsession, the symbolism and secret codes tucked inside each bloom. Yes, tulips were currency, luxury, fashion. But they were also language. Tonight, you walk along a tiled corridor in the palace's inner quarters, your steps softened by woven silk rugs. The air here feels hushed, like the books of a library are watching you. The walls are covered in floral motifs, not just decorative, but purposeful. This section of the palace was built to whisper, not shout. The Ottomans, like many cultures, believed flowers spoke in a language of their own. But they didn't just dabble in flower meaning, they developed a full lexicon of floral code known as salam. You pause beside a mosaic that features a tulip flanked by violets and hyacinths, each petal placed with intent. It's a conversation, frozen in stone. A red tulip meant passion, a yellow one, jealousy, a dark violet could mean mourning, or, more cryptically, a secret kept. This salam system wasn't universal, and historians still argue whether it ever truly functioned as a robust communication system or if it was more of an artistic flourish passed through poetry and elite circles. Still, the symbolism persisted. Ottoman poetry is bursting with tulips, blushing tulips, sighing tulips, tulips with eyes and hearts and longing, you duck into a smaller room, where court women once gathered to sew, sip tea, and share stories behind latticed screens. Here, salam became courtship currency. A woman might receive a nosegay, a tiny bouquet, with carefully selected flowers that delivered a message more daring than any spoken word. Imagine it, a suitor sends a yellow tulip, a thornless rose, and basil. Translated loosely, my jealousy is painful, but my intentions are peaceful, and I miss your voice. If she returned a single red tulip with a forget-me-not? That was practically a marriage proposal. You're not sure whether to laugh or swoon. A handmaiden passes by you, her sash embroidered with tulips. Even the fashion choices here echo unspoken feelings. Not because the women lacked words, but because their words had consequences. In this society, especially in the harem or among high-ranking ladies, the art of saying everything without saying anything was crucial. Flowers were perfect for that. You step into a courtyard where a marble basin sits at the center, catching moonlight in ripples. A tree leans over it gently, branches heavy with night blossoms. You can almost hear conversations that once happened here, low-voiced exchanges filled with metaphor, allegory, and petals tucked inside embroidered sleeves, and tulips weren't just for lovers, they appeared in spiritual symbolism, too. The Arabic script for Allah and the Ottoman Turkish word for tulip, layl, used the same letters. This made the flower a devotional symbol as much as a decorative one. Dervishes carved tulips into their walking sticks. Poets used them to represent divine beauty, the transient nature of life, and even martyrdom. There's a theory, still debated by scholars, that this shared lettering is one reason tulips became sacred. Were they truly divine flowers? Or did someone notice a neat coincidence and build a movement around it? Either way, the connection stuck. And for many, the tulip became both the symbol of God's oneness and a lover's breath on the neck. Which, if you think about it, is quite the range. You take a seat near the edge of the basin, watching a few tulip petals float gently on the water's surface. The night has deepened around you, folding the garden into velvet. You trace patterns in your mind, petal shapes, calligraphy strokes, secret bouquets. Even here, where flowers once spoke like spies in a coded opera, everything feels softened, and it hits you, tulips were never just beautiful. They were tools of connection. Through them, Ottomans navigated politics, love, faith, power, and grief. They embroidered meanings into pillows, baked them into sweets, etched them into gravestones. You glance up at the stars again. For a culture that prized subtlety, the tulip offered the perfect canvas, colorful but small, bold yet quiet, structured yet expressive. A flower that could be anything, if only you knew how to read it, and now, so do you. You wake to the faint sound of dripping water, steady, rhythmic, like a clock made of rain. But no, you're still here. Still nestled within the dreaming layers of the Ottoman Empire's tulip reverie. Only now, we drift further, away from flowers and flirtation, and into the marbled corridors of power. You're inside the Topkapi Palace now. Not the outer gardens or the bustling pavilions, but the inner sanctum where decisions were whispered, and sultans planned legacies. And guess what's still lurking behind the velvet curtains and brocaded thrones? Tulips. You move slowly through the divan chamber, where viziers once gathered under stained-glass windows. On every panel, tulips curve gracefully among vines and arabesques. The flower had become a kind of imperial signature, a quiet motif linking the sultan's image to refinement, grace, and yes, divine favor. By the early 18th century, Sultan Ahmed III had embraced the tulip so thoroughly, it became both a political brand and personal indulgence. Think of it as royal PR, but scented. Ahmed wasn't just planting them, he was curating their meaning. He commissioned tulip festivals, designed palace renovations around tulip beds, hosted nighttime garden parties where musicians performed while petals glowed under lanterns. You pass a mural of one such gathering now, robes shimmering, petals fluttering, guests reclining like sleepy satyrs beside shallow reflecting pools. Historians still argue whether Ahmed's tulip fixation was a form of escapism or clever diplomacy. Was he beautifying the empire to distract from its struggles? Or was he using tulips to project control, elegance, and continuity in a world of shifting borders and brewing unrest? Either way, it worked. For a while, you arrive at a room known as the Tulip Pavilion. The scent of aged wood and beeswax wraps around you. Above, a ceiling painted in soft shades of azure and peach blooms with, you guessed it, hundreds of tulips. Their stems curl around Quranic verses and lines of poetry, a collision of the sacred and the botanical, but there's tension in the brushstrokes, a faint anxiety beneath the beauty. And maybe that's because beneath the serene tulip cult, the empire was fraying at the edges, military campaigns had slowed. European powers were gaining steam. The Janissaries, once elite warriors, were growing restless and politically erratic. And the urban middle class, excluded from much of the floral fanfare, was beginning to grumble. You imagine one of them now, a bookseller in the bazaar, elbow deep in ledgers, scowling as another lavish tulip party is announced. "We don't need flowers," he mutters. "We need grain. We need stability." And yet, the tulips kept blooming, because tulips weren't just symbols, they were spectacles. The court used them to maintain morale, assert elegance, distract from shortages, and reaffirm tradition. Every bulb that bloomed was like a tiny act of reassurance: the empire is still graceful. The Sultan is still in control. It wasn't just Ahmed, either. His Grand Vizier, Nevsehirli Damat Ibrahim Pasha, leaned hard into the tulip strategy. He backed palace improvements, garden expansions, even civic projects, all wrapped in petals and celebration. Some historians view Ibrahim as a savvy reformer. Others accuse him of being too soft, too indulgent, too disconnected from the empire's realities. The truth, as always, probably lives somewhere in the folds of his tulip print robes. You reach a small salon, rumored to be where Ahmed III drafted poems to his favorite cultivars. One particularly dramatic verse mourns the loss of a rare red tulip during a drought. Another compares the first spring bloom to a long loss. You chuckle softly. Even at the top of an empire, a man could lose himself to a flower, but outside this floral fortress, frustration was mounting. You step out onto a stone balcony. Below, the Bosphorus stretches like ink spilled between two worlds. In the distant hills, you can almost hear the murmurs of rebellion, papers passed in tea houses, knives sharpened in back rooms, and the rising grumble of those who'd had enough, because tulips, for all their beauty, couldn't feed the poor or silence a soldier's rage. So when the empire finally cracked, when the people surged into the streets during the Patrona Halil revolt of 1730, the tulips fell too. Literally, you gaze out over the city and imagine the chaos. Gardens trampled, pavilions burned, rare bulbs crushed beneath angry feet. The rebels didn't just want regime change, they wanted to erase the symbol of decadence. And so the tulip era ended not with a sigh, but with a stampede. Ahmed III was dethroned. Ibrahim Pasha was executed. The tulips, once exalted, were suddenly suspect, but not forgotten, and even now, with the echoes of revolt fading behind you, you sense the petals stirring again. We're not done with them yet. The empire quiets, but your footsteps continue. You drift through the cooling corridors of a palace that has seen its flower beds go up in flames. The once proud tulip era now lies scattered like petals after a spring storm, trampled, swept away, and mostly forgotten by those who had never bought into its delicate spell, but you? You're still following the tulips, because after all that splendor, rebellion, and poetic posturing, here's the twist: the tulip didn't die with the tulip era, it evolved. You stepped through a narrow wooden gate into a more humble part of the city, away from marble and mosaics. Here, in the small homes of artisans, spice sellers, and apprentice calligraphers, tulips never stopped blooming. They just moved indoors. The obsession with tulips filtered down, not through imperial edicts, but through embroidery, tile work, and household decoration. Everyday Ottomans, despite the political chaos, began incorporating tulips into their folk art and daily life. You peek into a workshop lit by the orange glow of oil lamps. A mother paints a delicate red tulip onto a ceramic bowl, her brush steady despite the chattering toddler at her feet. She doesn't say the word symbolism, but she knows what the flower means. It's not about court politics now, it's about beauty, resilience, continuity, and this is where things get interesting. Because even after the fall of Ahmed III, tulips remain deeply woven into the cultural DNA of the empire. You see them on prayer rugs, stamped into metalwork, stitched into wedding shawls, and tucked behind ears during spring festivals. They had become comfortable. One popular urban legend claims that during the mid-18th century, black market tulip bulbs were sold in spice pouches at Istanbul's Grand Bazaar, hidden under layers of cinnamon and clove. Historians still argue whether these stories were real or just post-rebellion nostalgia playing tricks on memory. Either way, it's a lovely image, tulips returning to the people, one fragrant handful at a time. You step outside and head into a neighborhood tea house where older men sit cross-legged under grapevine trellises, smoking pipes and arguing over chess moves. On the wall, a faded tile mural of, you guessed it, tulips. Slightly uneven, a bit chipped, but unmistakably present, the flower that once meant elite opulence now belongs to everyone. You pause to sip from a tulip-shaped glass of tea. Yes, that iconic shape, slim-waisted and curvy, comes from the tulip as well. The glass design became popular not long after the tulip era, a quiet nod to the empire's love affair with the flower. Reimagined in something practical, communal, and warm, it's oddly poetic. The same empire that nearly bankrupted itself chasing tulip perfection eventually embraced the flower as a symbol of modest hospitality. Your journey takes you next to Edirne, a quieter Ottoman city to the west. There, in the gardens of an old mosque, a retired imam tells you about the tulips planted by his grandmother, red for passion, white for peace, pink for gratitude. They're just flowers, he shrugs, but they help us remember. The sun begins to set as you wander into a small cemetery. And there, among carved headstones worn smooth by time, you spot them again. Not fresh flowers, but tulips in stone relief, curling upward beside names and dates. One stone shows a single tulip bent at the stem. Historians believe it symbolized a life cut short, often of a young woman. This language, this visual shorthand, never fully disappeared. It morphed, melted, and made itself at home in the daily rhythm of life. Much like the empire itself, expanding, crumbling, but somehow always adapting, you run your hand along the carving and feel the grooves. The same line some artisan chiseled with care, decades, or centuries, ago. That simple act, creating beauty where none was needed, just because it felt right. That's tulip culture, and it wasn't just the Ottomans who carried it forward. Even in Europe, the tulip found new soil. Dutch tulipomania had its heyday well before the Ottoman tulip era, but trade between East and West meant bulbs, ideas, and aesthetics crossed borders. Some scholars suggest that Ottoman tulip designs even influenced Art Nouveau floral motifs in 19th-century Europe. Again, the evidence is hazy, the threads half lost in the embroidery of time. But if you squint at a wrought iron balcony in Paris or a floral lamp base in Prague, you just might see a hint of Ottoman bloom. As you return to Istanbul, the city begins to glow. Minarets catch the last of the light. Lanterns bob above alleyways. Somewhere, music drifts from a garden gathering, maybe a modern echo of the old palace parties, and near your feet, in a neglected pot by a doorway, a single tulip pushes up through the soil. A little scraggly. A bit late in the season. But there it is, still growing, still beautiful, still quietly political, if you know where to look. You return to the heart of the city, your steps slower now, partly from the length of the journey, partly because the empire's rhythm is starting to seep into your bones. Centuries of silk-robed processions, call to prayer echoing from stone domes, and yes, tulips, always tulips, threading through memory like a recurring dream. But tonight, instead of sultans or poets, you're going to meet the gardeners, because let's be honest, none of this tulip obsession could have happened without the people who actually coaxed those stubborn bulbs to life. And while the court may have taken credit, behind every bloom was a man with dirt under his nails and a small wooden trowel. You wander into a quiet corner of the old imperial gardens. Now open to the public. A young groundskeeper named Mahir nods as he rakes fallen petals into neat piles. He tells you stories passed down through his family, of great-great-grandfathers who worked in the Sultan's private gardens during the height of the tulip era. They called them Layl-Usta, tulip masters, he says. They were half botanist, half artist, and fully exhausted every spring. These tulip masters didn't just plant bulbs. They performed rituals. Whispered to the soil. Prayed for the right balance of sun and shadow. Some even composed short poems, known as tulip ghazals, to recite while watering, because tradition held that flowers responded to beauty. Historians still argue whether these rituals had any effect on the actual bloom. But the records agree, Ottoman gardeners developed one of the most sophisticated tulip cultivation systems of the pre-modern world. They bred for curve, for stripe, for pointed petals that looked like daggers made of velvet. And yes, for color, particularly the elusive black tulip, which may have been more poetic aspiration than horticultural reality. You bend down to touch a newly opened bloom. It's a vibrant purple, flecked with gold. Mahir notices and says, that one's called Yerim Ganal, half a heart. My grandfather said it only blooms properly when it's a mild spring and the wind comes from the north. Of course, there's no way to verify that. But here's the strange part, the tulip does seem unusually vibrant. You keep walking, and Mahir points out other rare varieties with poetic names, Saitzad Gulu, Prince's Rose, Aglayan Jelen, Weeping Bride. Many of these names survive only in dusty Ottoman ledgers or folk songs hummed by elderly aunties during tea time. But the flowers are still here, reblooming long after their keepers turned to earth themselves. In the height of the tulip era, the competition among gardeners was intense. Each spring, there were judged displays within the imperial palace. Gardeners were rewarded with silver coins, silk kaftans, even honorary titles for especially exotic or symmetrical blooms. One story tells of a gardener so obsessed with breeding a perfectly symmetrical double-petaled tulip that he allegedly spoke only to plants for 3 years. His final flower? It reportedly wilted within hours of blooming. Some say it was heartbreak. Others blame bad fertilizer. History remains divided. but these were men who treated gardening as a spiritual duty, not just for status or salary, but for the beauty of it all. For the chance to create something ephemeral and exquisite, knowing full well it wouldn't last beyond the season, you reach an older part of the garden where a low marble wall bears inscriptions in both Ottoman Turkish and Arabic. Mahir reads aloud a short verse: "To grow a tulip is to practice patience, to lose it is to understand time." It's not a famous quote. Just a line carved into stone, probably by some anonymous caretaker centuries ago. But it lingers in your ears like a lullaby, and here's the quiet irony: while sultans fell, rebels rioted, and politics burned hot as sun-baked domes, these gardeners just kept planting. They outlasted their patrons. Outlived revolts. Passed on their secrets like bedtime stories whispered across generations, their names rarely made it into official histories. Yet their work shaped everything. Every petal painted on palace tiles. Every embroidered tulip on a bride's veil. Every sigh of delight from a sultan gazing at his private bloom, it all began with a gardener and a bulb. And even now, centuries later, the tulip beds are tended. Not because the empire demands it, but because beauty has inertia. Once it takes root, it's hard to stop. You turn to leave, but Mahir presses a tiny paper envelope into your hand. "Seeds," he says simply. "From one of the old lines. Try them, if you've got the patience." You nod, pocket them gently, and step into the dusk, and behind you, the tulip masters keep working, quiet artists in the twilight, tending to their fleeting masterpieces. It's not a famous quote. Just a line carved into stone, probably by some anonymous caretaker centuries ago. But it lingers in your ears like a lullaby, and here's the quiet irony: while sultans fell, rebels rioted, and politics burned hot as sun-baked domes, these gardeners just kept planting. They outlasted their patrons. Outlived revolts. Passed on their secrets like bedtime stories whispered across generations. Night deepens now, but Istanbul doesn't sleep, not really. It just changes tempo. From the bustle of street vendors and fairy horns to the softer rhythms of clinking tea glasses, murmured prayers, and the rustle of wind through high plane trees. And through it all, the tulip persists. Tonight, you're chasing the tulip into the realm of religion and ritual, because while most people remember the tulip era for its lavish parties and extravagant florals, far fewer recall the flower's quieter life in Islamic symbolism and Sufi mysticism. You wander through the courtyard of a mosque, not one of the great domes of Sultanate, but a smaller, more personal space, tucked behind a row of fig trees. The marble is warm from the day's sun. You slip off your shoes and step inside. The tilework here tells a different story. Along the edges of the mihrab, the prayer niche, you see floral patterns curling like vines frozen mid-breath. Some are roses, some lilies, but always, again and again, the tulip appears. Not as decoration, but as message. See, in Ottoman Islamic culture, the tulip was more than just pretty. Its name in Turkish, Lail, shares the same Arabic letters as the word for Allah, when written in calligraphic style. The arrangement of these letters was no accident. Many calligraphers believed the tulip represented the divine itself, upright, singular, elegant without arrogance. A single tulip bloom, according to some early Sufi poets, reflected the soul's yearning to rise toward God. It doesn't scream. It doesn't sprawl. It just stands there, quiet, self-contained, waiting for the sun. You take a seat on the cool carpet, legs folded, listening to the faint echoes of a late-night dike, Sufi chanting carried on the wind from a nearby tekka. The voices loop and layer, rising and falling like breath, and in that moment, you realize something profound. tulips weren't just luxury items. They were spiritual instruments. Historians still argue whether these floral metaphors emerged from popular devotion or were retroactively assigned by court poets looking for deeper meaning. But whatever their origin, they stuck. Tulips began to appear not only in palace gardens but in illuminated Qurans, prayer rugs, and even funeral shrouds. You stroll next to a graveyard, where many tombstones bear floral carvings. For Ottoman women, the tulip often symbolized purity and divine beauty, its delicate stem thought to reflect a soul's graceful passage into the afterlife. One elderly caretaker tells you that tulips were sometimes planted beside graves to honor the deceased, especially among Sufi communities. Then there's the matter of scent. You wouldn't know it from the Dutch hybrids of today, but older Ottoman tulips were bred not just for color but for their fragrance. Soft, faintly spicy, with a subtle sweetness. Sufi dervishes used to crush petals into oils or burn them with incense during whirling ceremonies, believing the scent helped detach the soul from the world below. In one dusty manuscript you glimpse inside a Sufi library, a 17th-century mystic writes of the tulip of the inner heart, a metaphor for the self in perfect surrender. It blooms not by water, he says, but by silence. You might need that embroidered on a pillow. Your next stop is an artisan studio, where an elderly woman, Fatma Hanum, still practices the old tradition of Ebru, or tea. With practiced hands, she takes a thin needle and draws a tulip shape from the floating color. It shimmers, then she presses the paper down and lifts it. The flower is captured. One of a kind, she laughs gently. The tulip is the soul's signature, she says. It appears when your hand forgets itself. And you can't argue with that, it's getting late. You leave her studio with ink-scented fingers and a sense that tulips aren't simply grown, they're invoked. Prayed into being. Whispered into existence. Outside, the moon is climbing high. Istanbul's skyline becomes silhouette and suggestion. The domes and spires feel less like structures now and more like petals themselves, curved. Sheltering, rising towards something beyond comprehension. As you walk, you recall how, even during the political madness of the tulip era, the empire still made space for spiritual life to quietly bloom. Sultans might party, viziers might scheme, but in quiet corners, a flower still stood for the eternal. And if a symbol can survive palace coups, garden fires, and centuries of shifting fashion, maybe it was never just a symbol, maybe it was a mirror, a reminder that beauty, even borrowed beauty, even rootless beauty, can ground you. Can call you home. Can become holy if you look closely enough. You breathe in deep. Somewhere, someone is lighting another candle. Somewhere else, a tulip is opening in the dark. Your feet ache in the best way, proof that you've wandered deep. Deeper than most tourists. Deeper even than most locals would bother to go. But the tulip trail doesn't stop just yet. Tonight, you're stepping into the realm of print, pen, and propaganda, because the Ottomans didn't just plant tulips, they branded them. You duck into an old bookshop, one of those places that smells like binding glue, tea leaves, and the faint sadness of abandoned knowledge. The owner, a man with a beard like a tasseled curtain, is asleep in his chair. You tiptoe past and find a treasure, an Ottoman court album from the early 1700s. The cover. Tulips, of course, painted in gouache, each one more theatrical than the last. Flip through and you'll see what only the elite once saw, miniature paintings of tulip displays, surrounded by florid Ottoman script praising their elegance. One reads, "This bloom, curved like a saber's smile, surpasses all the gardens of paradise." Modesty was not their strong suit. See, during the tulip era, tulips weren't just flowers, they were status signals. Owning a rare tulip bulb, especially one with stripes or a unique hue, was like flexing a gold-plated iPhone today. So of course, they had to be documented, celebrated, and most importantly, shared, through art, calligraphy, and increasingly, the printed word, and that's where things get spicy. Historians still argue whether the explosion of tulip-themed art and literature was grassroots admiration or carefully engineered imperial messaging. Because sultans understood that if you can convince people to see something as sacred, rare, and beautiful, you can keep them focused on that instead of, say, tax hikes. Tulip-themed diwans, those elegant poetry collections, flooded the court. Poets competed in imperial contests, spinning metaphors where tulips stood in for everything from the prophet's footprint to a lost lover's mouth. Every metaphor more flowery than the last. One satirical pamphlet from the time mocked the Sultan as his petalness and described the empire as a vase too full, teetering on the sill of history. Sharp words, especially when everyone was still drying ink with rosewater, and yet, even after the fall, people kept the tulip close. Hidden in private prayer books. Painted on the inside lids of jewelry boxes. Carved into the backs of spoons. The propaganda may have faltered, but the emotion didn't. It's hard to completely cancel a flower. You think about that as you leaf through one last book in the shop. It's hand-bound, with smudged ink and delicate script. At the back, there's a poem by an anonymous hand, though empires wilt like summer leaves. The tulip dreams, and softly grieves. You close the book and tuck it back on the shelf. Outside, the sky is soft with dawnlight. The city holds its breath between the dark and the call to prayer, and all around you, you start to notice them again, painted on shutters, carved into stone, woven into headscarves. The tulips never really went anywhere. They just learned to bloom in quieter ways. One poet wrote, "Your glance, like a tulip's blush, sets fire to the page." A reviewer today might call it overwrought. Back then, instant fame, even military reports weren't immune. One general famously included a paragraph in a battlefield dispatch praising a rare yellow tulip he saw growing near a fort's moat. His superiors reportedly scolded him. Then asked for a cutting. The printing press, slow to gain traction in the empire, finally began churning out tulip engravings by the mid-18th century. And for those who couldn't read, there were public frescoes, tulip-shaped tiles, even ceramic plates with tulip motifs to signal refinement. You walk through a bazaar next. The stalls are quiet now. Shutters drawn, but by day this place would have glowed with tulip-themed wares, silk scarves, hand fans, water jugs, and yes, even tulip-shaped coffee cups, because nothing says luxury like sipping from a porcelain flower, and you're not imagining things. The shape of the cup does make the coffee taste richer. Or at least, that's what the elite told themselves, but this wasn't just about taste. It was about identity. The tulip became shorthand for civilized, modern, Ottoman. If you had tulips embroidered on your robe or painted above your door, it meant you were part of something elite, enlightened, and just a little smug. It was the imperial version of putting curated aesthetic in your social media bio. You sit now in a shadowed courtyard where a young woman is sketching. She tells you she's recreating tulip designs from old Ottoman manuscripts, designs once banned after the fall of the tulip era. That's right, banned. When rebellion finally cracked the surface of this flowery world, tulip imagery became politically radioactive. The once beloved bloom was suddenly seen as a symbol of excess, detachment, and imperial out-of-touchness. One satirical pamphlet from the time mocked the Sultan as his petalness and described the empire as a vase too full, teetering on tea. The tulip never left, even after riots tore through the imperial gardens. even after angry mobs shattered delicate fountains and torched pavilions in a haze of fury, the tulip simply bowed its head, and waited. Tonight, you walk through the hushed ruins of what was once Sotabad Palace, the heart of the tulip era's splendor. There's not much left. Some foundations, a fragment of mosaic, the ghost of an arch. But if you close your eyes, you can almost hear it, the murmur of silk robes brushing marble, the trickle of elaborate water features, the laughter of viziers discussing rhymed metaphors for moonlight. The whole place was built to impress, but not just visitors. No, this palace was a monument to Ottoman self-confidence, a declaration that the empire could adapt, indulge, and civilize with as much finesse as any European court. Maybe more, and central to that declaration, tulips, but like any dream made of petals, it didn't last. In 1730, the dream burst like a delicate bloom underfoot. It wasn't tulips that did it, of course, not directly. It was taxes, grain shortages, and the widening gulf between elites and the rest. But when the rebellion came, led by a grumpy, illiterate janissary named Patrona Halil, it aimed not just at policies but at symbols. And nothing symbolized the empire's detachment from reality more than its feverish obsession with flowers. Historians still argue whether Halil was motivated by populist outrage or personal vendettas. What's clear is this: the tulip era ended in fire, the lavish pavilions were destroyed. Rare tulip bulbs were trampled or stolen. Poets went silent. Miniature artists stopped painting. Those tulip-shaped coffee cups. Smashed, the reigning sultan, Ahmed III, abdicated. His reforms halted. His legacy twisted by caricature. And the tulip, once a symbol of refinement, became taboo. You sit now by the ruins of a garden pool, the water long gone, the tiles broken. But a single tulip has pushed up through the cracked soil. You stare at it, wondering how something so delicate could survive when so much didn't. In the years that followed, the empire limped on. It reasserted control. It modernized, cautiously. But the tulip era was never officially mourned. It was erased, tucked into footnotes and warnings: don't get too indulgent. Don't drift too far from reality. Don't decorate while the people starve. And yet, like all things deeply loved, the tulip snuck back in. Artists began to reintroduce floral motifs, subtly. A border here, a teacup there. Gardeners saved precious bulbs in secret, passing them down like heirlooms. And among everyday people, tulips never fully lost their charm. Because for many, they weren't about politics. They were about beauty. You return to the present now. The skyline of modern Istanbul glows ahead. Neon and minarets. Ferries drifting. Tea sellers pouring endless glasses under string lights. And the tulip is everywhere again, on subway posters, in children's books, etched into public benches. A century after the empire's fall, the Republic of Turkey declared the tulip the national flower. You pass a mural near Galata, a giant tulip rising like a phoenix, its petals shaped like wings. Underneath, someone has written, "We bloom again." You smile. That's the thing about tulips. They don't argue. They don't defend themselves. They just show up again. Quietly. Elegantly. With just enough curve to remind you that softness can be a kind of defiance. And now, finally, it's time to slow down. You find a quiet park bench. The breeze is gentle. The call to prayer fades into birdsong. The city stirs, but you, dear traveler, are still. The tulip that began this journey has taken you through palace intrigue, wild parties, mystical metaphors, garden feuds, rebellions.